with a huge round of applause, let's welcome Mr. Mehta on stage.
Thank you. Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay. So it's a bit tough doing the session immediately after lunch. It's sometimes known as the graveyard slot, because mostly people are still digesting their food and therefore very, very low on energy. So many years ago when I sort of analyzed this, somebody told me that there is a scientific reason for it, and the scientific reason is that most of the body's energy immediately after lunch is spent in digesting that food. So the energy to listen, to understand, and to interact is that much reduced. But I'll try my best to have a short, concise session about some of my thoughts on supply chain uncertainty and how important it is to drive synchronization in the whole supply chain as a context, as a consequence of that. Now, we are a little bit in the mind space last couple of years that things are very uncertain. You know, we have seen COVID happening, wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, etc. Now we see a lot of logistical bottlenecks happening across the world because of, you know, the problems in China, the problems in the Russia-Ukraine war, etc., etc. But I feel that the ability to deal with uncertainty and therefore the importance of supply chain synchronization has been there forever. In fact, if you ask any supply chain professional, the dream is to have a synchronized supply chain where demand, supply, manufacturing, your relationship with your vendors on one hand, and the relationship with your customers on the other is totally synchronized. The events of the last few years have probably exacerbated that challenge for us in supply chain community, where the need for synchronization is even more. But it is not that this is something new. This has always been a key challenge and therefore a key deliverable or of any supply chain for that matter. Now, before we sort of do a bit of a deep dive into what we can do to deal with this uncertainty, just I want to share a few thoughts about how supply chain typically looks at uncertainties and how we can evolve our thinking to looking beyond just, you know, I'm bottlenecked in my logistical infrastructure. Very important is to start linking the business uncertainties to our supply chain strategies and our supply chain capabilities. Typically what we see, if you look at understanding the nature of uncertainty, these are, in my view, the 4 different of how you would look at a supply chain uncertainty in any business. A scenario where every supply chain professional would dream of is a scenario where you have a clear enough future. That means you fully understand what is going to happen, or at least you think what is going to happen, and therefore you do the traditional supply chain planning of having a forecast, your uplifts, etc., and then driving the entire back end based on that very clear understanding of what the future looks like. Traditional ways of working, traditional strategic toolboxes are very much applicable to this, and some of the things that we have discussed in the morning are probably very, very useful in a scenario where we have a very clear understanding of what the future looks like. The focus is, of course, on medium to long-term planning, ROI maximization, etc., etc. But this is not the real world. In many industries, and so far, in fact, it is happening to a lot of industries now, we are moving to an uncertainty situation which is either 2 or 3 or 4. Now, in a situation where you have multiple alternate futures, very important for a supply chain is to start understanding what could be those alternate futures, start preparing for them, building the capability of what-if analysis, building the capability of scenario planning, and understanding what we can do to deal with these various alternate futures. A simple example is industries which are very strongly constrained by regulatory or legislative environments. You cannot predict fully what is going to happen, but at least you know if things go this way, this is what I can do. If things go this way, this is what we can do alternatively. Another of looking at uncertainty, or the third possible scenario is a range of futures. You're not clearly able to identify whether that particular scenario will play out or that, but you have a range of possible futures that you can start predicting. Now, take a simple example of all the startup industries that we have, or startup companies that we have coming up in the world, and even especially in India. So the kind of uncertainty that they're dealing with is, first of all, not a clear enough future, and in many cases, not even alternate futures. They're dealing with a range of uncertainties. Think of an example where my entire business model is built on customer acquisition or customer penetration. So the kind of strategies that I'll develop if I target 10% customer penetration to a strategy that I'll target with 30 to 40% customer penetration is very, very different. So again, the kind of demand planning capabilities that you need if you're in an industry or in a scenario where you have a range of futures is very different from the kind of tools, capabilities, and organization that you need to build if you have a situation where you have a clear enough future. So on the other extreme is a situation where you have really a complete ambiguity. You're not really clear what the future looks like. It is very difficult to predict. Your future depends on a large number of variables. All these variables are interlinked. If something goes up, something else goes down. That's very difficult to predict. So again, think of the kind of capabilities you need, the kind of tools you need to invest in to develop at least an insight into that kind of a future. So to start this discussion, very important for us as supply chain professionals, as demand planning professionals and experts, is to have a view of what the future looks like. Most of the things that we do, I feel sometimes, are more or less aligned to the situation of a clear future, so therefore we target a very systematic forecasting, uplift, statistical forecasting with various models, etc., while the reality is a mix of all these possible scenarios. So again, something to think about. So the first step in developing a supply chain which is synchronized between demand and supply is a very clear understanding of what kind of environment I am in as far as uncertainty is concerned. Once we have kind of understood the kind of environment we are in, once we have started to really drill down into developing very clear demand planning strategies to deal with these various uncertainty scenarios, then I think the next step would be to develop a comprehensive synchronization framework across the supply chain. So I basically think that it has to be across three dimensions. First of all, of course, the physical supply chain, very important, the business processes, and people systems. We sometimes overlook one or two, and most of the time we overlook the people systems. And in fact, I was very glad when in the panel discussion, the people part about demand planning came up and how the soft skills, etc., need to be developed, because these are some things which we really need to invest in as organizations to start driving that synchronization across the entire supply chain. So I'll just do a bit of a deep dive now into each of these elements. This is not exhaustive, just a bit of, let's say, thoughts that I have based on my experience on what we need to do to drive demand and supply planning organization. So as far as the physical infrastructure is concerned, a synchronized supply chain can only work when we have as much as possible real-time visibility of what is exactly happening. I'll give you a simple example, and here you have an example of how a Formula One team tracks the performance of the car and the driver throughout the race. A very good example, or a classical example of Formula One that is given traditionally, is the changeover time they have between tires. You know, many years ago it used to be 1 or 2 minutes, now it's 5 seconds. A learning for supply chain which is sometimes overlooked is the investment that these Formula One teams do in real-time monitoring of what is happening to the car, what is happening to the driver throughout the race, and fine-tuning it. So if you look at a sort of a control panel of the Formula One team during a race, you will find a best-in-class control tower. It is tracking what is happening to my tires, the tire temperature. It's happening what's happening to my car. Is my car moving well enough during the straights? Is it moving well enough during the turns? Yeah, what is happening to the outside temperature, what's happening to the roads, the road surface temperature, etc., etc. And they're also even tracking what is happening to the driver. All of this basically for a simple fact that they will take then real-time decisions to maybe change the injection rate of the fuel. They will play around with the fins in the way they're opening on the car, and they will even look at decisions on changing the type of tires that they're putting on the car. So similar investments, if we don't do into our supply chains to really have real-time visibility of what is happening across all stages of the supply chain, we will not be able to drive a full-scale synchronization between demand, supply, and all the other elements of supply chain. A lot of digital, I would say, control towers are coming up. Most of it is on the downstream side, so we have good examples of freight control towers, etc. But if you think of the entire synchronization, similar thought process needs to be right down through the value chain, from the downstream to what is happening on our manufacturing sites, to what is happening on our procurement sites, even looking at, let's say, vendor control towers, etc., etc. That's when you will develop really the knowledge, the infrastructure, which is flexible, which is fungible, which is able to react very fast to changes in the demand, and then translate that into changes in the overall supply strategy. So the first thing is real-time visibility of our physical infrastructure and what is happening there. When it comes to processes, two key things that I would like to call out is, first of all, we spoke a lot in the first half about S&OP. And to really bring demand and supply synchronization, S&OP is a bedrock of that. You cannot really bring a true demand and supply synchronization, forget uncertain times. Even in certain times, you cannot bring that unless there is a very strong, mature S&OP process. Now, typically what happens in an S&OP process, we saw that there is a lot of focus. There's a lot of focus on understanding, agreeing to the demand plans, but slowly, the focus on driving supply based on the demand outlook load over time. So your very strong base of S&OP should be underpinned with much faster, agile cycles of operational reviews, for example. So if your S&OP process is a monthly alignment of what the demand looks like, whether it is into the next 3 months or 6 months or 9 months, synchronization can only happen when it is underpinned by very fast, agile, weekly reviews, taking decisions on a weekly basis, understanding what is the latest trends in the supply, on the demand side on a weekly basis, and then aligning your entire supply chain to that. If you are in an industry where this decision needs to be taken daily, then you can imagine the amount of efforts that you need to put in. So an S&OP will help you to bring that long-term, high-level alignment about your business direction, what needs to happen, but true synchronization will only happen when there is a much granular, faster alignment at a much frequent level between what is happening on the ground and what is happening from the supply side. A very simple example that I can share with you that we worked on in Nestle is there is, of course, the S&OP process. The entire supply situation is refreshed based on the latest orders or projected orders that we see into the next 1 week. So yes, of course, there is an S&OP plan which is agreed and aligned with everyone, but the supply side has to start reacting to what is the latest signals, trends coming out from the market. Demand sensing, right? Very, very simple, but that's what it is. The other process which will drive synchronization is a more, let's say, long-term but a more continuous improvement process, is going from a traditional supply chain which is basically batch, to flow and eventually to pull. And the best way I find that to do this is through the concept of lean, through value stream mapping. Companies who have evolved into a highly synchronized demand and supply planning organizations have invested heavily in driving this. Understanding their entire supply chain, mapping out where are the inefficiencies, understanding where the bottlenecks are, and as a continuous process, continuously reducing those bottlenecks, reducing those efficiencies, creating, going from batch to flow to eventually pull. Now this is an ambition, but how to get it done is through a very regular review of your supply chain, value stream map the entire supply chain, understand where those bottlenecks are, and continuously work to remove them. So these are, in my view, two of the key processes that we need to invest in very heavily if we want to drive true demand and supply planning synchronization. One is an S&OP process underpinned by very fast, agile, flexible planning cycles, which are much granular and much higher in frequency, and at a strategic level, investing into a lean value stream capability, understanding, and continuously monitoring and making the supply chain more efficient. The third element, as I said to you, was about people. None of this, the tools, and of course with the advent of AI and ML, a lot of the planning can be automated, can be done by the machine, but it will never be 100%. Even in a very evolved state where we say that the demand planners or the supply planners for that matter should only focus on exceptions while the machine will do everything, believe me, first of all, it is quite far away for us in our current realities. And secondly, the ability to then to drive and work with those exceptions becomes very important. As far as demand and supply synchronization is concerned, the people capability has to start moving from a very silo-based, my function, my KPIs approach to a more cross-functional understanding. At the end of the day, if we do something in this part of our supply chain, how does this impact upstream or downstream? If we, for example, to reduce cost, increase the ordering MOQ, what impact does it have on the overall supply chain? Or if we invest into machines which have very poor changeover times, how does that my overall flexibility and agility? So very important from a people capability to start developing this cross-functional view and understanding what it is, how the various elements of the supply chain work together. And the second part on people systems is inculcating this culture of a very KPI-driven, smart KPIs. Everything should be transparent because it is now possible to measure everything. When I started supply chain 25 years ago, it was virtually impossible to measure anything. We could not even measure fill rates, for example. Now you can measure each and every element of your supply chain through data, through very intelligent reporting systems that companies have invested in. So that culture of looking at things more from the perspective of data and KPI driven, that's the second capability or the second people system that we need to invest in. So that, in my view, is how we can develop a clear, concise synchronization between demand and supply, first of all, by our physical infrastructure, making it agile and having real-time visibility through the control towers on everything that is happening. Then through processes, investing into end-to-end processes of a very comprehensive S&OP, which is underpinned by much more flexible, granular, rigorous review cycles. Lean value stream as an enabler to continuously look at our supply chain and eliminate waste wherever possible. And finally, on the people side. And just as a dream, this is what every supply chain professional looks at when you start thinking about what a supply chain is, which is, think of a synchronized supply chain. A supply chain where suppliers can organize raw materials and plan production on realistic and quantified lead times. Logistics providers can determine shipping requirements with certainty. Distribution centers have visibility for receiving, planning, labor, and stock holding. Shop floors are optimized. And last but not the least, finance department knows with certainty when to trigger payments and hedge currencies, etc. So this is a bit of a blue sky dream that every supply chain professional has. And as I told you before, a few things that in my view we can start working on to bring this reality to life. Uncertainty will always be there with us. It has probably gone up and makes us as supply chain community think that this is a new world. I can tell you it is not. Uncertainty will always be there, and the only solution to dealing with uncertainty is to really synchronize your entire supply chain, right from demand planning to supply planning to distribution planning and all the other elements of the supply chain. So yeah, thanks a lot for allowing this opportunity to share some thoughts, and we can have a few questions if there are.
Any question?
Good afternoon. My name is Balaji from Borosil Limited. Thank you for a very insightful presentation. My question is on value stream mapping. Can you give any examples where you have done value stream mapping in supply chain in your organization, which can give us some insight as to what kind of specific benefits can be realized?
Okay. So thanks, Balaji. So yes, I can give you an example. We have done multiple value stream mappings in my previous company with Nestle. So the way to start a lean value stream exercise is first of all to understand what is the consumer or customer value that you're trying to create. Traditionally, a lot of lean value stream exercises don't give you the required benefits because you're only focused on, for example, the flow of material within the factory or the flow of the material from the factory to the distribution center. Now that is really a very small part of your entire value chain. Your value chain is first of all starting from the customer and right down to your vendor. So the first thing I would encourage anyone who wants to do lean is to look at the value chain like that. Start with understanding what is the value that you're trying to give to the consumer and the customer, and start building up that value creation throughout your supply chain. Value stream mapping is just a tool which enables you to understand whether each element of your supply chain is creating value, or it is a non-value added activity, or it is an activity which is non-value added but required. So once you map it out, understand the flow of value creation through your value chain, then the next step would be, of course, to understand how I can, first of all, eliminate as many non-value adding activities as possible, and then bring out various projects which will then take you to the idea is slowly, the idea is not just to squeeze your supply chain. The idea is to make value flow much smoother, much harder through your entire value chain. A simple example I'll tell you. In many food, in fact in most food businesses and most for products, the big value that the consumer is looking for is freshness. Right? Now, how are we translating that into our supply chain? Are we working to ensure that the consumer on the retail is getting the freshest product possible or not? And then you will find something very unique, because we'll find that most of our supply chains are actually not designed to deliver the freshest product. Another typical example in the food industry is packaging innovations. Consumer is constantly looking for packaging innovations. Is our entire supply chain geared up to do that? Do we have vendors who can, at a very seamless, quick way, deliver packaging innovations? So that's the way to drive this continuous cycle of creating more and more value in your value chain.
Thank you, Pavel.
Well, thank you, Pavel, sir, for this wonderful session. We would like to felicitate you. May I please invite Mr. Anirudh Karnataki from CR Tires?